Historically, when countries launched offensives on their adversaries, it was done by military means. But we now live in an era where the threat of war does not just invoke imagery of missiles and tanks. Battles are now being increasingly fought in the digital space through cyber warfare. Cybersecurity attacks are severe threats to essential systems of countries. Cyber warfare is defined as the use of technology to deliberately attack a nation and their activities. Targets could include power grids, financial systems, airports, etc. Although there have been cyber attacks launched before, and the capabilities have been developed by countries like Russia, there has never been a quote-unquote war in the digital space. Today, offensive and defensive cyber operations are actively being worked on in many countries, like the US, Iran, Russia, etc. Interestingly, there's much more ambiguity to cyber attacks than regular warfare because often whoever carried it out does not claim responsibility. As a result, we are often left to speculate based on existing conflict. There are a variety of offensive cyber operations that can be launched. These include viruses, worms, malware, ransomware, as well as social engineering and spear phishing to introduce threats, and denial of service or distributed denial of service attacks to flood critical systems of traffic. Sophisticated attacks would employ multiple methods at once. In the last decade, there have been notable cyber attacks involving Russia, China, and Ukraine, but Iran was the victim of one of the more famous attacks in 2010, Stuxnet. This was a worm that destroyed a fifth of Iran's nuclear centrifuges. It's widely speculated that the US and Israel led this attack. Given this, we'll now look more in detail at the US and Iran conflict.
Tension between the US and Iran dates back to 1953, when the CIA planned a coup to overthrow Iran's prime minister. The US installed Shah ruled Iran from 1953 to 1979, denationalizing Iran's oil industry and killing thousands of anti-US Iranians. In 1979, protests forced the US-backed Shah out of Iran. Iraq then invaded Iran in 1980 with US support. In 1986, the Iran-Contra affair occurred when President Reagan admitted to a secret arms deal that broke the US embargo. In 1988, a major incident happened in the Persian Gulf when a U.S. warship downed an Iranian commercial airliner, killing all 290 Iranian citizens on board. The Pentagon stated that the radar used on the Aegis cruiser mistook the Airbus aircraft for an attacking fighter jet. In December of 2009, the Twitter homepage was hacked and replaced with "This site has been hacked by Iranian cyber army," including their Gmail address. The screenshot of the Twitter homepage can be seen here. President Trump approved the offensive cyber attack in June of 2019 in retaliation to Iran shooting down a U.S. surveillance drone, after initially threatening a conventional attack. The president then proceeded to assassinate their highest military official.
With the context of the Iran-US conflict in mind, we can now consider the ethical implications of cyber warfare. The first and most obvious issue is collateral damage. Today, software is ubiquitous, and much of the software used by military organizations is the same as that used by civilians. This means that attacks meant for military computers would likely also be effective on civilian machines, beyond military to bystander civilians. Civilians are also at risk because of the nature by which cyber attacks are implemented. In order to avoid spreading an attack to civilians, attackers need to have complete knowledge of an adversary's military computer systems, which is almost never the case. With incomplete knowledge of computer systems and addresses, attacks that affect civilians are more likely. Additionally, many cyber attacks rely on the manipulation of many intermediate machines between the attacker and victim. A particular point of concern regarding the ethics of cyber warfare is the potential use by terrorist groups. In theory, cyber attacks are more feasible for small organizations like terrorist groups than conventional physical warfare. Additionally, attacking civilians could be strategically advantageous in cyber warfare. For example, disabling power grids, telephone, and banking systems could be more effective for some groups than attacking military control systems. Another important ethical consequence arises out of a technical detail of cyber warfare. Damage assessment in computing is oftentimes very difficult. Computer systems can exhibit problems because of a variety of reasons, and damage may not be immediately apparent under certain tests. This creates an incentive to perform very large cyber attacks in order to ensure that sufficient damage has been done. The difficulty in assessing damage in computer systems also leads to a difficulty in repairing those systems after a cyber attack. This means that the effects of attacks that spread to civilians may persist for extended periods of time, and those effects can accumulate. Ethically, this is an important point because this means that cyber attacks can disproportionately affect technologically primitive countries.
In addition to ethical questions, the United States and other countries are now facing important policy decisions as well. According to a review at Yale Law School, United States policy currently only allows for attacks on combatants, civilians participating directly in hostilities, and civilians acting in a continuous combat function. Currently, laws only allow for states to conduct cyber attacks as part of war. While this is relatively straightforward, there is widespread debate about whether or not external groups are internationally sanctioned to target others. As a result, governments use non-militant individuals as proxies to launch attacks. This obscures the state with few punishments for the state that sponsored those individuals. This current framework poses several problems. As groups continue to debate policy, there has been no final decision about the legality of these maneuvers. In addition to this, many of the laws governing cyber attacks are pieced together from legislation not even intended to address cyber warfare in its current form. As a result, they're incredibly outdated and not comprehensive. Because of these varied problems, states are vulnerable to breaking future international policies and also vulnerable to attacks from outsiders not directly affiliated with other governments. Considering the ambiguity with whom may be attacked, corporations are potentially in an even worse position since they do not have the strong infrastructure to prevent disruptive cyber warfare. Since the mid-20th century, Iran and the United States have grown into a tense relationship shaped by emerging forms of warfare. While the United States' ability to combat cyber warfare has remained strong during this time, it poses ethical and political questions that affect many sectors. As cyber warfare continues to develop, the United States must commit to strengthening its policy and infrastructure.